Legends of Runeterra entered Set 5 with high hopes. Bandle City was the 10th and final region to be announced and introduced multi-region cards to the roster. Bandle City brought various playstyles to the table, from darkness control to landmark destruction. But one playstyle took over the ladder and caused frustration for months: Swarm and Rally. So, let's talk about the champion responsible for months of meta domination. From Bandle City and Demacia, let's chat Poppy. Poppy was revealed to a muddled reaction of the player base. They understood that she was strong, and how her buffing up weaker allies thematic was a great transition from her lead character. But she was immediately compared to Vanguard bannermen, who had barely seen competitive play as elites, and had proven a wide board doesn't always win you games without strong keywords. A big power trough that Poppy also suffered from was that her champ spell sucked. A 6 mana place a unit at the top of their deck is terrible, and it's almost on sunk cost levels of a bad spell. And alongside the Keeper's Verdict and Pompous Cavalier made it seem like Poppy's weakness was coming from the supporting roster of Bandle cards. Well, any doubts in Poppy's power level were swiftly quelled as her decks swarmed the ladder. While the cards shown in Poppy's reveal were underwhelming overall, the player base realised that the Bandle cards were brutally overtuned. Lecturing Yordle was the premier 4-drop follower due to its ability to create a poison dart on summon, meaning decks that relied on 1 HP blockers such as Shadow Isle's Control lost a lot of defensive power. And then we have the most aggravating card for ASOL players ever printed: Aloof Travelers. On release, this card was a 3/4, giving you hand advantage and forced your opponent to discard their highest cost card. Tenor of Terror is an interesting one. 2 understated cards for 4 mana is pretty good, but their impact and ability to be buffed by Poppy to make a 3/4 and a 4/3 is terrifying. Because of Bandle's popularity, these 3 cards were seen incredibly often, and the player base made it known that they were not fans of these new cards. So, we've got well-statted units to work with Poppy, but what about if they're playing on the back foot? After all, Wallop wasn't printed yet, so the defensive capabilities for Poppy decks were lacking, right? Well, sort of? This is where Poppy's dual citizenship comes into play. Being able to be run as a Demacian champ opened her up to take Sharp Sight and Concerted Strikes, 2 of the best spells in the metagame at the time. And of course, Bandle had Minimorph. While resting at a pretty balanced mana cost, Minimorph's burst speed caused a lot of grief to the player base as they cried about uninteractivity. Some things never change, huh? So, now we've got strong units, a good champion to pair with them, and defensive tools to keep key units alive. All that we're missing is how to actually win the game. Like I said earlier, Elites proved that big stats alone can't win games. Well, that's where Rally comes into play. 3 mana Relentless Pursuit paired with 3 copies of Golden Aegis meant that as long as the Poppy player had 2 other units on board, they were winning the war of attrition. In theory, you could rally twice on turn 5, and that's Poppy leveled or leveling on her next attack. And it was a suffocating play pattern that squeezed all defensive tools out of your opponent. This cocktail of an overpowered board and access to survivability is why Poppy decks took up a stronghold in the meta. Which takes us to the World Tournament, taking place a month after the release of Bandle City. Now, since the release, Poppy decks were being held down from being premier by 3 builds. Draven Scion discard to utilise fearsome units early game and get excited to answer Poppy on the turn she dropped, with Draven Tribeam decks also countering her in a similar way. Nami Zoe was an interesting matchup, as has a very weak board before turn 5, where, if the stars aligned, a level Nami was hyper buffing the then 2 mana Sparklefly to the point where it lifestealed you into submission. And of course, who could forget Siva Akshan? This perfectly curved mid-range deck abused the high health stats of Merciless Hunter and Ruin Runner to find amazing traits and end the game using Sivir's leveled aura alongside the Absolver. However, just before Worlds came in, patch 2.15 and Shurima's Reckoning had arrived. 3 nerfs to their key cards meant that the representation of this deck in the competitive field fell drastically. Now that one of Poppy's counters had fallen in priority, she rose up, with some players even teching their deck to win out in the mirror by running cards such as Riposte. Players had also figured out that they couldn't run high costed units into the current meta and abandoned Aloof and Lecturing Yordle for Bandle Commando and a full set of Yordles and Arms. Aikaido brought something a little different though. Now Lulu had always been paired with Poppy in these Demacia Bandle decks in order to enable Yordlesmith to grant the whole board quick attack. But what if you didn't need Bandle City at all for Poppy to succeed? What if you just needed elusives? This was the only Ionia Poppy deck at the tournament and was utilised to subdue Zoe Nami as the Sparklefly couldn't remain untouched anymore. This was the first iteration of Poppy Ionia and paved the way for this region combination. Funnily enough, Poppy decks weren't played by any of the medal winners at the event, and they couldn't keep up with the control and spell damage focused meta. Now, between Worlds and the Beyond the Bandlewood seasonals, multiple new Bandle City decks arose that used Poppy in a weird way. First off is the Bandle Tree. This card was a nightmare on ladder due to the fact that if it wasn't destroyed, it won on turn 9. As there was a lack of landmark removal in the game, players hated this card. Bandle Tree decks swarmed and didn't attack. They just kept their units on board to block attacks and wait out the timer. Poppy was included in this deck that didn't want to attack purely because she was a Demacian multi-region unit, and the only other card like that was Pompous Cavalier, which is crap. The other, far more interesting deck to hit the meta was Poppy Ziggs Burn. Utilising the pre-nerfed Stone Stackers and Ziggs to get a ton of base damage early, Poppy was added to allow the weaker 1-drops of the deck to trade into tough blockers and to make fearsome units hit base even harder. As you can see from this graph from Runeterra CCG, Poppy owned the meta and was represented in 4 of the best decks. Elusive Rally is the previously mentioned Poppy Ionia pairing, but with one big difference. Lulu was out and Zed was in. Zed working very well alongside Poppy as all buffs he received got passed to his shadow, enabling an even more threatening attack. By the time seasonals arrived, Poppy was queen of the meta. As you can see from the champion representation of both AM and EMEA, the only champs that rivaled her were Draven, due to discard and Tri-Beam being meta staples, and Zoe, who is paired with both Nami in Lifesteal Elusives, and Lee Sin, a brutal OTK combo deck. While stats for each player at the tournament aren't available, Poppy was picked in one form or another by 2/3 of the finalists at the tournament worldwide, and was banned twice. In both instances that they weren't banned, however, whether it was Demacia, Bandle Rally or Bandle Tree, the players piloting these decks lost and claimed silver medal, meaning Poppy had not been played and won during a final. Now, with the tournament over and the dust settling, Riot realised the meta was getting stale and decided to target some frustrating units. Patch 2.18 saw nerfs to Stone Stackers, weakening Poppy Ziggs Burn, and Aloof Travelers. This ended up also removing them from a lot of meta decks such as Tri-Beam. Unsurprisingly, Poppy decks were barely touched, and so continued to be a meta staple. With no other important card changes going into the Before Worlds tournament, Poppy was still top dog, with her pick rate towering over the duo of Sejuani and Gangplank, whose Plunder deck was seeing a ton of success. In the EMEA finals, Paynas was able to take the win and gold by running Poppy Elusives. In the Americas, both finalists ran a Poppy Misfortune combo deck, which was basically just Scouts without Quinn. Kuchua was able to win the mirror matchup, but unfortunately for him, Black Boss came back for a 2-1 victory. APAC actually had no Poppy decks in their final, instead preferring to go with Plunder and Swain Burn as the reliable meta decks. Then, finally, on the 7th of December 2021, patch 2.21 was released. Both Poppy and Young Witch, who was a staple in elusive decks, were nerfed. Poppy was brought down to a 3-3 after 3 months at the top. But that didn't stop her. The one attack nerf didn't do anything to quell Poppy decks, and paired with the insanely powerful release of Ari Kennen, Riot were forced to do a hotfix patch. In this, they nerfed Poppy a second time, down to a 2-3. This was the end of Poppy in competitive play. At the Magical Misadventures Seasonals, Poppy was picked once by Lazy Guga, who ran 3 Bandle Tree decks to the finals of the Americas, and then lost his final game in a Bandle Tree mirror. Bandle Tree was thankfully nerfed soon after this tournament, which left Poppy in a weird spot. She didn't really have a meta deck left. Lulu Poppy Bandle City still kinda worked, but couldn't find over a 50% win rate in the meta, which left her one final option: Taric. Poppy Taric is the only viable Poppy deck for climbing in the last 8 months, and is a combo deck utilizing Taric's ability to copy spells to rally multiple times. Due to its combo being both multiple units and slow speed reliant, this deck has not seen competitive play during the Curious Journey seasonal. This fall from grace shows how powerful a nerf to a single stat point can be in card games. Is it likely that Poppy gets her attack point back? No! It's likely that Riot will leave her in this position for the foreseeable future, and she won't see competitive play. Unless of course someone figures out how to pair her with Bard.